manufacturing part of DC, they came to us and asked us if we could create something that they could make into a toy. And
I want the toy.
Yeah.
But it's got to be like one of those Japanese ones that actually moves. 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 Those Japanese ones that actually moves.
This San Diego Comic-Con, it was announced that Frank Miller and John Romita Jr. will be doing Superman Year 1. While my initial impression was, oh, we're going to be getting another standalone Superman origin story, the 4th one to be exact. But most people were concerned that, well, Frank Miller was writing it. And this was a warning sign because, as most people would tell you, Frank Miller apparently hates Superman and can't write him really well. I say this because I myself can't tell whether or not Frank Miller hates the character or not. There are interviews with him saying that he hates Superman, but I can't help to think that he's joking around in these interviews.
And remember who won.
So my big question is, do you hate Superman?
Of course. Who wouldn't hate somebody who could fly? Somebody who was just loved by everybody, was the handsomest guy who would get all the dates. Of course I went for the underdog who had a nasty streak to him and played a much nastier game than Superman.
So instead of taking his word for it, let's look through his work to see whether or not he hates Superman. And in this example, I'll be using the Dark Knight trilogy. Not the movie series, the comic series that Frank Miller has had a part in since the beginning. Now keep in mind that this is in my perspective, so it might be a bit different from yours. The original Dark Knight Returns is probably the story that started this debate in the first place, and maybe the reason why so many people seem to dislike Superman, since this book has a lot of influence on DC, from the comics they make, both canon and non-canon, and the movies. This is a dark universe where all the heroes have gone their separate ways except for Superman, who has become the US's water boy. He is still shown to be pretty heroic in the story, but ultimately he is the final boss of the story. You see, while the Mutant Gang was the first initial threat in The Dark Knight Returns, the true villain, in quotations, of the story was Authority. For example, in the new segment of the book, many of the people who are against Superman say that he doesn't follow the rules and call him a fascist, so basically he's against authority. And in The Dark Knight Returns, Superman is the one who represents authority the most. He is nearly the embodiment of authority. In a sense, the characterization of both Batman and Superman in The Dark Knight Returns are pushed to their limit, to where their ideal world is so different. That's what makes the final fight of this book so impactful at the end. The monologue Batman says during the fight is most likely Frank Miller venting about the flaws of Superman, and this will be important later. But at the end, it kind of leaves us on a lighter note. The way I perceived it, Superman and Batman both went their separate ways. Superman did do the right thing at the end, as Batman is no more, but Bruce Wayne still lives on and doesn't need the cowl holding him back. Well, at least until The Dark Knight Strikes Back. But all in all, I feel like Frank Miller wrote Superman as a decent character in The Dark Knight Returns. I considered The Dark Knight 2 to be a joke, one made for the type of people who would actually want a sequel to The Dark Knight Returns. The first issue destroying the promise Batman and Superman had made, parting separate ways, and having Batman only appear 1/8 of the issue, only to punch Superman. Superman is perceived to be rather pathetic in this story, even more than how he was in The Dark Knight Returns, especially from the way he's drawn. The relationship between Batman and Superman seems to be more divided than ever, Superman being the old-fashioned man, while Batman is the one who wants change in the world, the revolutionist. But there are times in the book where Superman can be perceived as heroic, such as his fight with Brainiac, where a lot of the news seems to be giving praise to Superman. All in all, the story is very confusing, but standalone, without The Dark Knight Returns in context, it's just a weird, wild ride of a story. And now we are on to The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, which has just only ended recently. The story itself is more of The Dark Knight 2 than The Dark Knight Returns. even though it tried to reintroduce a lot of the characters from the original Dark Knight Returns in the beginning. The characters from The Dark Knight 2 became more essential at the end. The interpretation of Superman in this story isn't that bad. I only remember one scene where he was treated in a negative light, because for the most part, The Dark Knight 3 is kind of his story, or at least his relationship with his daughter, Laura, who is the offspring of him and Wonder Woman. While the initial story was about a group of Kandorians who wanted to take over the world, that part of the story is really pushed back, and this book becomes more of a prelude to something bigger, it seems. The book all around is just okay, but I really want to talk about the final issue of the series, because that issue really outshadows the whole entire book in every way. This final issue is probably the most pro-Superman the Dark Knight series has ever been. In the previous issues, Superman has revived Batman by putting him in the Lazarus Pit, which also made him younger. The fight between the Kandorians, aka the Master Race, is still going on as Batman decides to join, but Superman pats him on the chest and says, "Leave it to me." And as he holds his chest, Batman says that it's as if the weight of the world was on his chest, just showing the impact that Superman brings to everyone. Superman decides to fight the Master Race because, unlike him, the world still needs a Batman. At least he thinks that. Now, in previous fights where Superman was in the Dark Knight series, he's always perceived to be rather pathetic and always ends up getting just beaten the crap out of. For example, in The Dark Knight 2, at the end of the first issue, he was just beaten the crap out of by the Flash and Batman. But in this issue, we realize that Superman has been holding back all along, and he just fights so well against the Kandorians, aka the Master Race, that Batman ends up admitting that he's still a student when he comes to fighting. That's really telling you something. With only a few left, the Master Race decides to basically self-destruct, as we've seen before in The Dark Knight 3, so this wasn't just something that randomly came up. But the Atom shows up and shows this experiment that he's been working on throughout the series, which basically shrinks all the Kandorians except for Quar, who was the leader of the Master Race. While Quar is still planning to self-destruct, Laura, aka Superman and Wonder Woman's daughter, grabs him and throws him up into space, and we assume that she is dead by then. Then we jump 2 months later. We have this random Trump page for no real reason except to make a Kryptonian and immigrant analogy. And then we jump to Batman as he says that Superman has basically left the face of the earth. And this is where the good stuff gets in. He apologizes to being such a douche throughout all the Dark Knight series. Through all the monologue he made, saying how he was the right hero in The Dark Knight Returns, and just beating the crap out of him in The Dark Knight 2, for saying how useless Superman can be in the modern day, and that right now that we really need him. I quote him, "Take us with you, Boy Scout. After all, we raised you. You're one of us, my friend." Now, if you don't know, calling Superman a Boy Scout is kind of like, it's kind of a thing people say to shit on Superman because he's like so childlike, or how he only apparently can appeal to children. And then we see Carrie Kelly, who is now Batwoman, in her new upgraded suit, and the two go on more adventures to come. Like I said in the beginning, with the Batman and Superman fight in Dark Knight Returns, I feel like this is Frank Miller venting out, but this time apologizing for having such a dislike of Superman throughout the Dark Knight series. The second half of this issue is more contributed to the heroes, because now we are out of the Dark Universe, as it seems. All the heroes are back to doing what they do best. Then we catch up to Clark and Lara, who seem to be perfectly fine after the incident involving the Master Race. Laura's character in The Dark Knight 2 and 3 can be described as one of those characters that are supposed to be hated. by the reader, since she is very arrogant, young, and overpowered, and she doesn't quite understand what it means to be a hero. But at the end, Clark gives her a speech telling her how great it can be to become a human, and that it's one of the best things that ever happened to him. At the end, we leave off on a note of Clark teaching Laura how to be human, first off by putting on the glasses. And from this whole issue, I feel like the main message is that maybe we need old-fashioned superheroes back. Maybe we need to cut off the edge that this series has become with the Dark Knight 2. Laura kind of resembles what edge this series has become, while Superman is the old-fashioned hero that brought this new age back. What I hear most people saying about the Dark Knight 3 is that, for the most part, Brian Azzarello wrote this, not really Frank Miller, which for the most part could probably be true, but this issue stands out so much compared to the rest of the series that it's just something that Frank Miller would write. The Dark Knight 3 was split into 2 parts for each issue. The first part telling the main story with art by Andy Kubert, and the second half being The Dark Knight Universe Presents, with Frank Miller doing the pencils. In the previous issues of the second half, the art has been some Dark Knight 2 tier stuff. But then notice how in the final issue, the second half, which also had pencils by Frank Miller, is the good Frank Miller art. The one that is on some Dark Knight Returns level. I know there are colorists and all that were involved, but it's just an observation on how important this issue is when it comes to the rest of the Dark Knight 3. So other than that, what do I think this issue means in the case of Frank Miller hating Superman? Well, I think that this issue was a prequel to Superman Year 1. Not in continuity or anything like that, but for Frank Miller as an artist, as he comes to accept Superman and why he is so appealing. Just to make this clear, just from all the stuff I said in this video, I don't think Frank Miller totally hates Superman. Yes, maybe he has some problems with him, and he most likely probably prefers Batman way better. But I'm not really concerned that Frank Miller is writing Superman Year 1, but rather which Frank Miller is writing it. The one who worked on Dark Knight 2, or the one who worked on the final issue of the Dark Knight 3. And when it comes to John Romita Jr. working on the art, I know people have problems with him, but I think he can do a good Miller-like art if he really tries to do so. Anyways, what do you guys think? Do you think Frank Miller hates Superman, in your opinion? And can you give examples? Do you think he redeemed himself with this issue of the Dark Knight 3? And what do you guys think about Superman Year 1? Do you guys think it's going to be in the Dark Knight continuity? Or do you think it's going to be in the current DC Rebirth one? Or do you think it's going to be post-Rebirth? Comment below, subscribe if you want to, because if you want content like this, I'm planning on doing a Superman origin story comparison in the near future.
His beginnings from when Pa Kent discovered him in the cornfield, when the little boy grows to youth and then to manhood.
Are there any characters that you really want to play with that you've never been able to touch before?
You know, through Dark Knight, I got to touch just about all the ones of the DC pantheon, but I've never really had my real meaningful crack at Superman.